Inclusive leadership is how we lead diverse teams and organizations. But how do we do that exactly? What do we mean by inclusive leadership? How do we become inclusive leaders? And what does it look like in practice? We really have a lot to explore here tonight. So let me go ahead and introduce our facilitator for tonight. Michel Shah is the founder and president of the UpSkill Corporation and UpSkill Community. She's faculty at George Brown College and program director of the Master's Certificate in Leadership at Schulich Exec Ed York University. She holds a Master of Science from LSE, so London School of Economics, as well as a BA from the University of Toronto.
Correct.
So a love for UTSC, learning, and commitment to inclusive leadership are things she shares in common with Dr. Tettey, who is our very, very special guest for tonight. And now it is my distinct privilege and also pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Dr. Wisdom Tettey. He is the Vice President of the University of Toronto and Principal of UTSC, as well as a Professor of Political Science and Development Studies. His research interests include media, politics, and civic engagement in Africa, transnational citizenship, and the African diaspora. Dr. Tettey has served as a consultant to various international organizations, including the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, the Africa Capacity Building Foundation, and International Association of Universities. He's an elected fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences and currently serves on the board of Civic Action and on the advisory/editorial boards of various academic publications. Now, this brief intro only scratches the surface of Dr. Tettey's accomplishments, as well as the significant impact that he brings not only to UTSC and UFT, but our city and country more broadly, especially from the standpoint of inclusive leadership. So there's so much more that I can say, and I know that you didn't come here to hear from me, you came here to hear from him. So I am delighted to hand the conversation over to Michel to lead us off. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tiffany. And thank you to all of you who've attended this session. And as Tiffany says, we're looking forward to your comments, any ideas you have to share, as well as your questions in the Q&A. Dr. Tettey, it is my distinct pleasure to have this conversation with you. And so delighted. Thank you. Thank you. And before we jump into any conversation about inclusive leadership, I really would like to hear a little bit about the story, how it came to be that you came from UBC to U of T. And tell us a little bit about that journey and how we got so lucky to have you right here in our neck of the woods doing this amazing work.
No, thanks for those kind words. And, I'm honored and humbled to be here to share this. I always look at these things as opportunities for a conversation. So I'm hoping that it doesn't become a unidirectional exchange and that we're able to engage. So I think Tiffany put everyone on notice about the Q&A piece, but let me go to your question. And so it's more like by way of UBC, because it takes to taking you back. I grew up in Ghana, did my undergrad in Ghana, went to, university in Ghana for my undergrad, and then came to UBC for grad studies. Made my way to Kingston for doctoral work, stayed there a little bit to do some, teaching there. Then started moving out west, ended up in Calgary for a long time, moved on to UBC, and then back here, right? And so, for me, this journey is always about finding common purpose with organizations that you're a part of. And having shared values about certain things makes it easier to do the work that we do, because you already are starting from a place of a shared understanding of what is the purpose of the work that we do. What are the fundamental principles that undergird the work that we do? And so coming this way was because I was coming to your alma mater that manifested those values. And I felt, okay, this is a place where you can be able to make a contribution with people who are like-minded, people who have, shared aspirations for what we as humanity need to do for one another, to support one another, and to ensure that we're lifting everybody up. And as an educator, there can be nothing better than to be in an environment where everybody is buoyed about making things possible so everyone can have a lift. So that is the Coles version of my story, landing here in Scarborough.
Thank you so very much. It's always, storytelling and listening to stories is really such an important of how we develop inclusive leadership. I know you talked about purpose. I spent a full day with leaders today designing purpose. And this purpose is what brought you here, alignment to your purpose. One of the things that I know you've accomplished since you got here, which is very, very ambitious, such a huge stretch goal, is the leadership that you've provided UTSC to design this strategic plan, 2020 to 2025, this inspiring, inclusive excellence. I would love to hear all about it. And I'm sure there are leaders here who would want to learn the process of putting such a strategic plan in place and what are the implications for a strategic plan at an institution like U of T that talks about inspiring inclusive leadership.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, all of these are a culmination or a confluence of different things, right? I have always operated in environments where the desire to bring people together, to recognize people, to be able to draw on the expertise and assets that everyone brings together has been something that I've always, has always been part of my upbringing. I always talk about my mother in these contexts about growing up. Our home was always a place that everyone came to. Everyone was welcome. It was sometimes difficult for people to tell who my mom's real kids were and who were not. And so this whole thing about, connecting with people from different backgrounds, different experiences, and so on, helps to build your sense of the value of our common humanity. And the fact that we sit in different places at particular points in time, but that does not define the totality of who we are. And if we look beyond those moments and look at what it is that we all have as humans, I think it allows you to yearn for a coming together as opposed to creating divisions and so on. So, when I came to U of T, this was already part of the community's ethos. There was a commitment to bringing people together. The institution felt like it was part of the community. And so it wasn't a huge lift to get people to mobilize, but certainly, being able to bring a vision that reflects people's own aspirations, reflects their lived experiences and so on was easy. But the process is as important as the vision, because we might all share the vision, but how we get there and mobilizing people around a common purpose and ensuring that they all feel that they own the outcome of that work is important. So we try to bring the community together, explain why this work was important, link it to their own values, and then mobilize them and give them spaces and voices where they can, in fact, articulate their own truths and recognize that our truths may vary, even as we see common aspirations. And so how do we accommodate those truths and those realities? And empowering people to feel that leadership is not just a hierarchical thing, that you can exercise leadership at all levels in all spaces. And I think that was a good way to get us started. And once you unleash that, the possibilities are endless. And so the outcome that you see is, in fact, mobilizing people, empowering them, and enabling them to be able to aspire to the best of what we are possibly able to get to. So that hopefully gives you some sense about why, and then some essence of the process. But fundamentally, I think as leaders, because people are very skeptical about things around inclusion and strategic plans and so on, because a lot of it can be performative, right? And so if you want to be able to do this in a way that really is authentic, then you should give people room to be critical, to ask questions, to ask for accountability. And one of the big things for me is always having these plans have accountability markers so that people are able to hold you answerable. And that elicits trust, credibility, and it brings integrity to the process because they co-own it. They have every right to ask questions and to push, right? So anyway, hopefully that gives you some sense of things.
We're beginning to feel some of the juice of this already, Dr. Tettey. This is great. I listened to that response and realized the role of leadership. And one of the stories that I always tell about leadership is if you think about having pieces of a vase put down and that we have a responsibility to pull together in a whole vase as that were the vision, it takes a glue, a good quality glue to pull it all together. Mm-hmm. But if you actually see the glue, it's actually a poorly done work.
Exactly.
So the
Exactly.
leader is that glue that pulls all those disparate pieces together in a way that the leader is not even seen. But everyone knows there's no way for this vase to be held together without a good quality glue. And the better the glue, the more invisible it is.
Right.
And I think that's
Absolutely.
what you just described in terms of how you pulled a community that had their own ideas, their own visions, their own truths, critical ideas to add to it, how you bring all of that together. That was really great. And I hope all of us are taking out some pointers out of that. And so before we go any further into this conversation, Dr. Tettey, let me ask you first the question that I begin every conversation with. What exactly is inclusive leadership?
Well, I think inclusive leadership can operate at two levels. One is internal to the individual who is in a leadership role. The other one is much more external, reflecting the community of leaders of every organization, right? And so as an individual, you have to be able to exhibit certain qualities that allow you to bring people together, to recognize people, to offer opportunities to people that would otherwise not be there. So that requires you to have an understanding of your community, to be culturally competent enough to understand that we all come to this space with different experiences, and being able to acknowledge those experiences and validate, the assets that everyone brings to the table. And that was, part of the reason I said earlier about leadership reflects in different spaces, right? It's not always about the organizational structure. And so if you recognize that leadership comes in different ways, you might have people who would otherwise not be in these spaces, be voices that allow you to get to things that you'd otherwise not be able to get to. They bring different perspectives that enrich the community. And so as an individual, I think it's important for you to be able to value that opportunity to be able to draw on a diverse community. The other piece about it is being able to walk in people's shoes. So the notion of empathy allows you to be responsive to the specific, places that people are coming from, to the specific context that people are coming from. Because if you haven't walked in someone's shoes, and that is not to say you do an exact replica of that walk, but being able to get some inkling into what it is that brings people into particular context, it allows you to be able to engage with them in a way that is not condescending, but rather one that sees them as asset-wielding individuals, as individuals who, irrespective of their state at this point, have something that is valuable to bring to the organization. And the other thing I'll say is, part of your thing is to be other aware, right? You have to be able to understand the world in which you're operating and be sensitive. And at the beginning, you had mentioned something about emotional intelligence. I think it was Tiffany when she was introducing you, right? The ability to be able to connect and to understand and to elicit the trust of people is important. And trust is not something that you can just will. It has to be earned. And so an inclusive leader has to be able to bring people into their orbit. And part of how you bring people into your orbit is to be approachable, to be understanding, empathetic, and to be open to critique. Because once you close the doors to critique, people don't feel that they're invited into that space. So what do you do to do that? And I think modesty, understanding, the humility that we should all have. Because if you know it all, then you're not going to, what's the point in bringing all these people in if you know it all, right? But if you're able to understand and be humble enough to know that you don't cover all the bases and that all these people can in fact help you enrich that and drive the organization forward, that is important. So those are some of the elements of inclusive leadership that I think is important. The recognition that there's wealth in our common asset, which is our individual parts coming together in totality. The other part is the more of the outward part that I talked about, right? Because inclusive leadership, for it to work well, has to be regenerative. And so you have to be able to see those inclusive leaders be able to fill the organization. So it's not just one person sitting in this corner who is it. Of course, that person can be an enabler, but they should be an enabler for multiple versions of themselves. And so if an inclusive leader and you are the it, and you don't cultivate other inclusive leaders, you're not going to be able to do this work. It's not easy work because you're challenging status quo, you're moving things forward, you're bringing other people into the fold who have traditionally not been welcome into those spaces. And so I think culture, building the culture of inclusive leadership is an important part of the process. So it shouldn't just be inhabited by the individual, it should exude out of that individual and other like-minded people, and they should support the growth of more such leaders. So that I'll leave it there, and we can probe further as necessary.
Yeah, that's very, very rich. And you ended up on the note around creating a culture of inclusive leadership, a culture of inclusion. And I'm reminded as an educator of Bloom's taxonomy that lower down, is to understand it, to be able to identify it, to apply it, but it's at the top of this taxonomy that you create. So then inclusive leader is a higher order leadership skill. Then it's not just being a leader, applying leadership skills, but creating a culture of inclusion becomes a very high level calling, right?
Absolutely. That is absolutely critical. And I think that's part of the obligation of leadership, to be able to be the one that says, this is acceptable, this is not, and this culture is not going to be tolerated, and this is the kind of culture we're going to cultivate. And being able to model that and eliciting other people's support for that is an important part of this, which means then that we have to be able to reward that kind of culture and to be able to collectively mobilize behind that. And this is my point about the culture, because then it's no longer a single voice pushing this, right? You begin to have other people who are ambassadors for the cause, because they've all imbibed this thing. And what is right is not just something that the leader at the top says. What is right is something that your peer who is sitting next to you is able to exercise that leadership and go, look, what you're doing is not inclusive, because they have imbibed that culture.
Yes. And, developing this whole culture of inclusion is such a big topic. Before we get into talking a little bit more what that takes, I want to bring us back and ask you, what are some of the challenges that you're noticing with the very term inclusive leadership brings both challenges and opportunities? What are some of the challenges that you notice in your work in this field?
Right. And I'll speak to two elements of that, because when you talk about inclusive leadership, people then assume then that, things are not going to be the way they are, right? And so obviously there are people who see this as losing ground. And I say to people, is just reorganizing the pie. You're not taking away from the pie. Is a question of bringing other people into that space who would help to enrich the space. But I think the trepidation around inclusive leadership comes from a sense of loss, where people think that what they are, and by and large, they're feeling that they're entitled to that. And they're entitled to that, in a very exclusive way. And therefore, bringing other people in that space takes away from them, right? And so that is the challenge, because that is what the default, the status quo, those who have the power to occupy these spaces see it as ceding power, as opposed to, in fact, being able to absorb like a sponge the wealth that comes from more people coming into that space, right? So that is a big part of what we deal with. And the other challenge about it is about the performative piece of it. It's become so commonplace, it's become almost, glamorous to talk about it. And the hard work of being able to demonstrate it and do it and push it is not as easy as it may sound, because you might see everybody using the term and you go, oh, everybody is for this, but it's not always the case, right? And so that is a huge part of what the challenge is. And I think that, the other challenge I'll say is about what people will consider to be appropriation of this term, because, others are beginning to use it who are part of the status quo in a way that still protects, right? And so there's this tendency to tokenize the concept by bringing particular people in who will be the face of this. And particularly with, certain identifiable groups, bringing them in does not necessarily mean that you have an inclusive leadership culture. You could have a diverse group that is not inclusive. And you can have a group that looks like the others that you presumably are trying to build, bring in, who do not reflect a culture of inclusion, because you could be part of the status quo, even though you might look different, right? And so it's important that we critically interrogate these things by asking fundamental questions about the substance and not just the form of inclusive excellence. And so those are some of the challenges. And I think it's important that we call them out for what they are, because it allows us to hone this concept further, not just as a rhetorical device or as an abstraction, but to be able to make them real in the lives of our organizations, our communities, and so on.
That's so fantastic. Thank you so very much for that breakdown. That was really, really helpful. I want to pull up on this concept of the tokenizing and the performative piece, because one thing that I noticed with a particular organization was that the token was not even a person that came on board. The token was an image on a website. And there were images of identifiable groups splattered across the website, but the representatives of those groups did not exist within the organization either. And so just really sort of knowing that these are the things that we should put up, but it's not actually existing within the organization. So in a way, you talked about the token in terms of hiring one person from each of these groups to have as tokens. But what about the step where you don't even take that step? You just post up an image of all of these groups.
Exactly. And that is the performative part that I was talking about, right? You can't in fact know all the ropes, know all the correct things to do, and be able to express it in the form, right? But not in the substance. And I think that the distinction between form and substance is absolutely critical, because you could also have people even in the room, but whose voices are not accorded pride of place, right? Whose voices still get marginalized even in those spaces. And that is what goes to the substance of these things that you could, in fact, so the example you gave is the most disingenuous part, where you don't have them and you put it on your website and so on. But there are cases where, in fact, people do have them. And the challenge, you were talking earlier about some of the challenge of inclusive excellence, is bringing people into this spaces, presumably to do the work that is required and not supporting them. And therefore, kind of leaving them to dry, right? And that has led to a lot of frustration by people who've got organizations with a lot of goodwill to do the good work and realize that the organization, in fact, is not ready for the change. They're ready for the talk, but they're not ready for the action that is required to deliver on that talk. And that could be really challenging for folks who are in these spaces.
Ooh, so how do we know when an organization is ready? What is it that needs to be in place for us to be able to, if we were to audit an organization, what are the items, what are the features that we say, these are the keys that let us know this organization is now ready to engage with inclusive leadership, not just in form, but in substance? And second component of is form a prerequisite for substance? Just those two questions in one.
No, I don't think so. I think you could, in fact, demonstrate inclusive excellence through substance right away. Because who is sitting where, whose voice is heard, whose voice is validated, is not a question of form, right? And in fact, when you have that culture that is ingrained in the organization, it can begin to find representation in the forms of the organization. So I argue that it's better to start from substance, because that substance builds you credibility, it builds you trust, it allows people that you're trying to invite into the organization to say, well, you know what, I can see evidence that this is happening, right? And once it becomes routinized, it becomes part of the form, with which you do things and so on. When you have form and no substance, you're on really rickety ground, because you are actually vulnerable to critique, that you're not able to get the wealth of talent that you'd otherwise get, because people are smart enough to see whether or not you're just window dressing or doing something. But also remember that the best people for you as ambassadors are those who experience that reality. And so if they experience it and it is in fact authentic, they'll become your voices that draws other people in. If they experience it and it's inauthentic, they'll be the people who go out and say, no, 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 that's not the place for you. They say it, but they don't do it, right? So that would be, how I respond to that. I think you should start. It doesn't mean we are perfect from the beginning. We all travel this journey and we continue to be better versions of ourselves as we go along. But we have to be able to demonstrate substantively that we're committed to this. And that commitment is shown when the going is tough, because it's easy to recede, right? It's easy to relapse into the old familiar when the going gets tough. So those are the moments where you're able to say, is this organization really ready to take on the mantle of inclusive leadership? Or are they jumping on the bandwagon when things look fine, but when the going gets tough, they are the first bail, right? And so for me, the substance, no matter how minimal it is, it's an important precursor to moving to the next level. And it's absolutely critical that you have that.
Okay, fantastic. I'm glad you clarified that, because sometimes, leaders may say, well, we have to start somewhere. At least we start here. And so it's so good that you clarify that the place to start is at the substance. And so I'm going to ask you to go back to the question I started with, is if you were to pick out 5 keys or 5 markers of an organization that's ready to begin this journey, what would those be?
I think you start from acknowledging the reality of your organization, because in order to cure something, you need to know what it is, right? And so rarely have I found an organization that is perfect from scratch, right? And so acknowledging the fact that there's work to be done is a good starting point. The failure to acknowledge, if you claim you're perfect when you're not going to make amends. You're not going to make things better. So being able to recognize that you do have deficiencies in this area is a good starting point. And the next thing is beginning to create systems that begin to address those areas, right? So you recognize something, you do something about it. So what are the processes that you go through to do that? And because in order to enable systemic change, we have to begin to put in place processes to address what it is that has created the status quo. And as you do that, hand in hand with that, you are trying to bring visibility to why this work is important, because you have to bring people along, right? People need to, we all are human. People are uncomfortable with change. People are, as I said earlier, people are seeing this as a loss and all of that, right? So you've got to be able to, as a leader, mobilize people to understanding why this is in fact good for the organization, and in fact, good for them as individuals, because they all get enriched by that process. And so how do you demonstrate that? So you go into that change management process, helping to build a common understanding, a shared understanding, and anchoring this in some core values that you have as organizations. So I would expect that organizations would want to be able to get the best talent. The organizations would want to be able to have a culture where people are healthy working in that environment. And you want to be able to have this become part of your routine, right? And so on. So that culture piece then comes forward. And as that culture becomes embedded in the organization, you begin to have the shock absorbers that allow you to still stand when challenging times hit. Because you've already built the substructure. And the things that I talk about are the substructure. Then it becomes easier to scaffold on top of those. If you try to go to, the shiny, glitzy things that everybody sees without doing the hard work of embedding this into the organization and the organization's culture, it'll be harder to do. And it becomes ephemeral, because when, as I said earlier, when the tough times hit, it's easier to fall back to what is familiar, right? So if you're talking about what are the things, I'll say acknowledgement, putting in place the processes to make amends, creating the spaces for a culture that embraces inclusion, and beginning to demonstrate that this is not just a passing phase, but that this becomes intrinsically woven into the culture of the organization. And that sets you up for the work that follows, So that is my distinction between the substructure and the superstructure there.
That is amazing. Thank you so very much. That really wraps up a number of the key issues. Commitment is really what we're talking about here, the commitment. And I really like how you touched on values, because I've been engaged with a number of organizations who have their values on their website, but the leadership team or many members of the organization don't even know what the values are or where to find them on the website. So these values are really just espoused in some way on the website, but no one is actually engaging with these values. They're not part of the organization. They mean nothing. And sometimes this value may mean one of the values was in one organization was inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And the members of the organization didn't even know it was there, don't know that that's a value that they have or ought to have and be adhering to and working and showing this in how they work. And so when we talk about this demonstration, I think that is a really key concept, not just putting up the facade, but actually going behind and building out the structures.
And if I may just add something, Michelle, I think because the point you raise is really, really important. And for me, it's always been the compass, right? It's always been the reference point. And so when things get challenging, which they will, get, you go back to those values as anchors, right? And so what is it that we've committed to as a collective? And is this thing that we're doing antithetical to what it is that we're committed to? So it becomes a constant reference, and it becomes part of the, the psyche, it becomes part of the imaginary. And this is where my point about accountability then comes in, because when you put that thing out, you're saying, hold me accountable for delivering on this. And that empowers people. That allows people to go, okay, you're putting your money where your mouth is. And it allows you as a leader, because it goes to your integrity, right? Now, if you're not delivering on something that you have outwardly professed and that everyone in the organization has embraced, now you are not modeling it. How can that be, right? And so that, even as we continue to learn, I think it's important to anchor these things in core values that are shared and that we're held accountable for.
We continue this conversation next week and look forward to having you back.